welcome to another episode of Ask a Pianist. My name is Andrew Aarons, and today we'll be looking at a subject which, in truth, I hadn't thought about for many years until a student had brought it to my attention. When we create the illusion of phrasing in pieces, the tendency exists to increase our volume as we play higher notes, and lower it as we play lower notes, essentially following the written shape of the notes with a dynamic equivalent. Even in small gestures, like turns, or large gestures, like melodic leaps, we still seem to follow this tradition. As my student asked me, why? Let's look at perhaps the most common and traditional case. In the opening of Beethoven's Opus 110, Beethoven gives us a set of running notes that span about 4 octaves or so, which move up and down the keyboard. Bear in mind that, so far, we have a singular marking of piano, leggermente, and a crescendo that starts late in the section. Aside from this, there's nothing to suggest that we should have small crescendi and decrescendi for each broken chord gesture, nor are there any slurs or legato lines either. So, let's break down the basic gesture. The shape of the whole line can be taken from the notes that have lone staccatissimo vertical lines. The interesting part, once we've boiled it down to this, is that we're now faced with the question, why do we tend to get louder when we go up in the compass of the keyboard, and get softer as we go lower? Why don't we do the opposite as an example? Much of the following explanations will be speculatory in nature, though I myself am convinced of it as of today. First of all, lower notes on the piano tend to have more complex spectra than higher notes, and furthermore, they tend to cause notes higher than them in pitch to vibrate sympathetically, whereas we don't hear the same effect on notes lower than the pitch that has been struck. This is a very interesting property of the piano, that the full sound of low notes benefits from sympathetic extra vibrations in the upper notes, whereas the upper notes do not receive the same reinforcement. This means that if we were to play a low note and a high note with the same downward acceleration of the key, we'd have a dynamic discrepancy. The low note would sound louder to our ears than the high note. This dynamic consequence is something that causes a bit of a problem. If played equally, the A-flats and Gs that create the basic shape of the phrase in the Beethoven will naturally get louder as they go down the compass, and get softer as they go up. I'll play it with the damper pedal held down so that you can hear the problem even more obviously. How do we make the upper notes clear to the listeners in this artificial case? Well, we can either articulate them more sharply, like this, or we can simply make the upper notes louder and the lower notes softer. Now, this is important to note. Articulation can solve this issue. The more percussive we play, the more the audience can hear. But we can't always do this in a musical sense. In the Beethoven, each note that defines the total shape of the gesture is articulated in a similar way. To articulate any of them differently is to contradict the score. This is why, if we need to create an artificial construct of shape to the line, we have to alter our dynamics. Without dynamics in pedal, we have this. Now, with a dynamic line that gently crescendos to the top and gently decrescendos to the bottom, we have this. So far, we've managed to counteract the physical properties of the piano so as to create a uniform line. But this isn't enough to create a phrase. In the past, I've mentioned that our ears are attracted to change. Change in dynamics, articulation, pitch, and rhythm. Elements that are consistent are first noticed, but then ignored in favor of elements that are changing. When we adjust the dynamics to take into account the different resonance properties of the high and low pitches, we're really only leveling the playing field so that the notes sound equal. The next step, which is what we usually think about when we practice, is how to make the notes that we want the audience to pay attention to sound special or interesting. This is where aesthetic judgments come into play, of course. How do we make this phrase sound beautiful, for example? And this is where our interesting tradition also comes into play. How can I shape the phrase to appear more appealing to an audience? This example in the Beethoven Sonata is one that we find quite often in just about every period of piano music. We have a regular pulse with even notes that move back and forth over the compass. This happens in Mozart, usually as a scale pattern. It happens in Chopin, usually as arpeggiated figures, like in this Beethoven. We find it even as late as Prokofiev and Shostakovich. It really is a style form, commonly used, perhaps due to the needs of the instrument. So, once we've evened out the dynamic level of the arpeggio patterns to create even playing, we run the risk of the pattern sounding repetitive and predictable. This is further exacerbated by the staccatissimo marks, which outline not only the outer and lower boundaries of the pattern, but also create accents which mark each eighth note in the bar. This kind of regularity is useful when we play etudes or studies, but it has very little use when we're trying to express something musically. This point deserves some clarification. Occasionally, a composer wants to specifically comment on pianists or the sound of practice. The Pianist's movement from Saint-Saëns' Carnival of the Animals comes to mind. Perhaps the composer wants to make an aesthetic statement that criticizes known compositional tactics employed by artists who the composer may consider their own inferior. Or the rhythmic stability is called for in a piece because it comes at a time when rhythm becomes the primary expressive element. But the difference between all these cases comes from what else is changing around the rhythmic event, which is now regular and thus predictable. When the composer is making fun of pianists, then everything is regular and predictable, and our attention is drawn to the banality of it all. When the composer is making an aesthetic statement criticizing the use of scales and patterns, then perhaps the composer may recreate poor harmonic progressions they've heard from their inferiors. But when a regular rhythm becomes a primary expressive element, then all the other elements of harmonic progression and dynamics are carefully constructed to be interesting and yet unobtrusive. So, what do we have in Opus 110? Well, harmonically, it's nothing special. The rhythm is regular and marked, and there are no markings of dynamic change. Essentially, every element that should provide interest does not, and most, if not all, elements are repeated so that it is predictable to the ear. Therefore, if we want to make this interesting to the ear, we have to do something with it. The neutral version, to refresh your memory, sounds like this. The traditional dynamic approach to shape this kind of situation would be to exaggerate the neutralizing forces, get louder at the top, and get softer at the bottom. There's a secondary consequence of this approach which needs to be mentioned. If you're simply exaggerating a pre-existing strategy, then you have a lot of room if you make a mistake in terms of amount. If you get too loud at the top, it's not too bad. And if you get too soft at the bottom, it's not too bad either. This approach of getting louder at the top and softer at the bottom lines up nicely with the harmony. In chord form, the A-flat major tonic is stabilized by having only one chord in the bass. The dominant E-flat has 3 in the bass, all acting as upbeats, similar to the opening of the sonata. Listen for it. There are always 3 upbeats. Now, we see this in the bass of the running note section. 1, 2, 3. If this is not a coincidence, and Beethoven is using the same upbeat tactic, albeit spread out this time, then the dominant E-flat chords will naturally be softer than the tonic A-flat chords, both in terms of consonance and dissonance, as well as rhythmic direction. This is what I mean by the phrasing strategy matching up with the harmony. The highest notes happen to be on the tonic, with the lowest on the dominant. We could try to play this the opposite way, where we go louder as we go lower, and softer as we go higher. However, if we continue through the piece, we confront a direct contradiction to what happens later, with Beethoven actually calling for a crescendo as we get higher and higher. So it can't really work this way. There are other possibilities as to why we do this, of course. Perhaps it's because we feel that lower pitches indicate pitches that are close to an instinctual foundation of sorts, as if low notes represent the ground and high notes represent the sky. Moving upwards in pitch would be moving away from the ground, and moving downwards would be returning to the foundation. This feeling of home and away from home is definitely used in classical music, though I can't find precise reasons why we feel this way, or interpret the sonic material in this manner. Is it instinctual? Is it a product of how we hear music from an early age, perhaps? Does it have to do with human vocalizations and speech patterns? Or even the fact that when we're babies, the secure voices we hear are always lower in pitch than our own? I'm not sure if we'll come to an answer anytime soon, but shaping our dynamics according to pitch direction and location is so common in performance of classical music that I can't help but think that the cause is probably a universal one based on human experience. Regardless, it remains a good place to start when you are first shaping your phrases, and it rarely ever fails. So, that's it for this episode of Ask a Pianist. Until next time, keep practicing, and allow yourself to always question why something is done, even if it leads to more questions rather than a simple answer. Bye for now.